As enjoyers of Thomas the Tank Engine, there's lots of experiences that we share as a fandom. Whether it be watching the wonderful mess that is Magic Railroad for the first time, or spending a day at the Thomas Land theme park, opening a brand new piece of Thomas merchandise, or getting to see a piece of lost media revealed to the public. The list goes on. Now, due to age differences and whatnot, not everyone has experienced the same things. But if there is one experience that almost all Thomas fans share, it's going to a day out with Thomas. This is the quintessential Thomas experience. You get to go to a railway surrounded by trains and people who love Thomas just as much as you. Sir Topham Hatt is out and about taking pictures with kids, storytellers are reading a selection of Thomas books, there are tales of Thomas Wooden Railway and Trackmaster you can play with, and you can find all the latest Thomas merchandise. This is basically our Comic-Con. The event has been going on since the 1980s, and the fact that they are still going on means a lot of people have gotten to experience it and many more will. And the best part of the event is getting to meet the real-life Thomas. After watching all his misadventures on the island of Sodor, you are given the chance to board his train and explore the scenery of your local railway, surrounded by people who share your love of trains and this little blue tank engine. It's definitely a memory you'll hold on to for a while. But if you happen to share your experience around the fandom, you'll notice that what people remember as their childhood Thomas can vary from person to person. If you live in the United States, this is probably the Thomas you remember. But if you are from the UK, any of these could be your Thomas. Some parts of the world even have more engines than just Thomas, such as Japan having a Hero, Percy, and James replica. Every part of the world has Thomas replicas that are special to them. You're probably not aware of most of these replicas due to them not being that well documented. Over here, we've only ever really known our custom Thomas replica, but in other parts of the world, they will rebuild entire Steam engines to play a character. Most engines bios tend to omit their time as these characters, even if it was for an extended period, and footage of them at these events is often hard to come by, and that is such a shame. I want to change that though. There are so many interesting Thomas replicas out there that I think more people should know about, so that's why I'm going to catalog all the Thomas & Friends replicas that I can find. I have a list of 63 railways from around the world. Each one has hosted a Thomas event and employed a number of engines that play the characters. I'm going to go through every location on my list and tell you what engines were there, what characters they played, when they debuted, and any other interesting facts I can find. Before we start, let's determine what I'm considering a Thomas replica. Basically, any engine that appears during a Thomas event dressed as a character. This will usually be denoted by the engine wearing a face or at the very least a nameplate or number. Not every engine with a face will be counted though. Due to limited resources, most railways can't afford to build or buy engines specifically for the event, and will often just slap a face on whatever engines they have available, whether or not they resemble a character. In cases like that, I'll consider what features the engine has and determine what character it most resembles. For example, if there is a green tender engine, I will probably consider that to be Henry, or if I see a saddle tank engine, that will likely be Percy. If there's an engine that doesn't line up with any established characters, I will exclude it from the list. A common occurrence you'll see is railways loaning out engines to play certain characters. This happens a lot with the Thomas replicas. Rather than mentioning each time an engine played a character, I will only mention the engine at the railway in which they debuted. I won't be counting any custom-built displays of characters or theme park attractions, only actual engines. They don't need to be operational by the time of their debut, they just have to have been functional at some point. And I will also not be covering any rolling stock or non-rail vehicles dressed as characters. There's even less documentation on these, and it honestly seems like a pain to try to find and identify them all. Plus, this video is already going to be long, so I'm just not going to bother with them. I think that covers pretty much everything I wanted, so it looks like we can get started. As we catalog these engines, I'm going to do something fun and keep track of which replicas use a character-accurate basis. I think it'd be interesting to see how many of the replicas are faithful to the characters, so place your bets now as to how many accurate engines you think we'll find. Anyway, let's quit stalling and get to work. I think it would be most appropriate to start this discussion with the very first engine we could call a real-life Thomas. Engine number 1800 was built by Hudswell Clark in 1947 for the British Sugar Corporation. Its working life was spent pushing wagons of sugar beet up an incline all the way up until 1973, when it was withdrawn and replaced by diesels. The engine had received the nickname Thomas as a result of its blue livery, and in 1971 was officially named Thomas by the Reverend Autry himself, and was subsequently given his face and number. The Nean Valley purchased Thomas in 73, and that's where it's remained ever since. The railway saw an increase in visitors whenever Thomas was running, and so made Thomas Days a regular event, basically starting what we now know as Day Out with Thomas. At these events, you could find other engines dressed as Sodor residents, such as Percy, portrayed by Hunslet number 1953 Jack Screen. This engine was built in 1939 and worked at the Nassington Ironstone quarries not far from the Nean Valley. They joined the railway in the 70s and can be found masquerading as Percy by 1986. In 87, Jack Screen was withdrawn and placed on static display, and though it's remained on display since then, it can still be found playing Percy. Daisy also appears, played by the Swedish Y7 railcar number 1212 Helga. This engine first came to the railway from Sweden in 1984, but would leave in 89 following the death of its owner. After some time away, Helga would return to the railway in 2011, debuting as Daisy as late as 2014. This is quite a peculiar basis for Daisy considering its shape and livery, but as I said, railways generally work with what they have. Oliver can be found in 2017, played by the Great Western Railway 1400 Autotank number 1450. This engine is normally based on the Severn Valley Railway and played the character during its brief stay on the railway in 2017. Now, in the books, Oliver is a 1400 Autotank, which means this replica uses an accurate basis, giving us our first accurate engine. And lastly, we have Diesel 199, portrayed by Deltec number D9000 Royal Scots Grey. This engine entered preservation in 1983 and was first based at the Nean Valley, and at some point during its time here, it debuted as the character. This railway has no Thomas of their own and would borrow Thomas locomotives from other railways. As per my rules, I won't be discussing them here. Instead, I'll be looking at the other Sodor residents. Only two engines appear on this railway, the first being Percy, portrayed by the Peckett R4S class number 2104. One of three modified R4s that was given a lower cab for its work at Croydon Power Station, and one of two that have played Percy. 2104 joined the railway in 1989 and debuted as the character as late as 1997, and it held the role at least until 2008. The other engine is Daisy, who is played by a pair of Class 117 DMUs, number 51367 and 51402. The set was formed in 1997, and they debuted as Daisy that same year. Most DMUs are combined in the set, so it will become a common occurrence to see Daisy appear with multiple sections. The Battlefield line is another railway that imports their Thomas locomotives. However, at one point they did have a locomotive of their own. Around the 1990s, number 7537 Richard III, a Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne design, could be found portraying Thomas. This engine previously worked at the Nechells Power Station and was acquired by the Battlefield in 1972. They returned to the Thomas sometime in the 90s, and at the latest lasted until 2004, where they were then withdrawn. Richard has been in pieces since then, but as of 2019, efforts to restore him were still being put forward. As for other engines, they have Henry, played by the Thompson B1 class Mayflower. They joined the railway in the mid-2000s and started appearing as Henry in 2008 and ran as him until 2011, when it was withdrawn for overhaul. In its place, they had Great Western Railway Country class number 3803 take over the role. They were loaned to the railway in 2011 from the South Devon Railway and acted as Henry for about 2 years before the Battlefield stopped hosting Thomas events. They also have a Percy played by the OX1 Peckett Sir Gomer. They joined the railway in 2001 and debuted as Percy as late as 2005, holding the role until the final event. Toby is an interesting one. Rather than being portrayed by a steam engine, it is a Ruston and Hornsby diesel rebuilt to resemble the character. Having a diesel portray Toby will become a common thing, considering that the J70 trams were all scrapped. Number 235513 debuted around the late 90s and was often lent out to other railways for their Thomas events. Toby remained in service until about 2009 and is currently in possession of the Railway Support Services in Wishaw. Our first diesel on the list is not only played by a Class 08, the class of engine diesel is, but is potentially the real-life diesel. Number 13236 came to the railway in 2005 and debuted as Diesel that same year. According to research by Sodor Island Models, this engine's history lines up with that of Diesel's, and it is believed that they are the same engine. They would remain on the railway until 2008, when they were loaned to the Bluebell Railway. After the departure of 13236, another 08, number 08528, took over the role by 2011. They could usually be seen participating in the engine races and would last appear as the character in 2012. And with that, we can add 2 more engines to the count. Daisy was portrayed by the Class 122 DMU number 55005, as well as the Class 116 and 118 DMUs number 51131 and 51321. The units joined the railway in the 90s and debuted as the character as late as 2005. 55005 typically operates as a single unit, which is more accurate to Daisy, while the other two form a 2-car set. The sets would take turns playing the characters throughout the 2000s, but by 2011, 51131 would be withdrawn for overhaul, and for the last few events, 55005 would be paired with 51321. Boca would start making appearances around 2009, being portrayed by the Class 25 number D5217, and would maintain the role until 2012. You could find Mavis on the railway around 2005. They are played by number 03170, a BR Class 03 that is based on the Epping-Ongar Railway. It would seem that after being withdrawn in 1989, but before joining the Epping, number 03170 spent some time on the battlefield, though I can't say for how long. Lastly, we have Motorrail Simplex number 9921 portraying Rusty. 9921 joined the railway in 2001 and lasted at least until 2010, and much like Toby, is currently sitting derelict in a siding. Here, Henry is played by the BR Standard 4 number 75029, fittingly called the Green Knight. The engine is based on the North York Moors Railway, but prior to arriving there in 1998, the engine was moved around a fair bit, going from Longmoor to Eastleigh to the East Somerset, and then in 1995 the engine made a visit to the Great Central, where you could find it portraying Henry. Donald and Douglas can sort of be found at this railway. Douglas started appearing as late as 2002, played by the 8K class number 63601. The engine entered preservation in 1960, and after being moved around a lot, they ended up at the Great Central in 1996, and was promptly overhauled into working order. They held the role at least through 2003, but by 2009, a new pair of engines could be found playing the twins. The BR Standard 2 number 78019 and the Stanier 8F numbered 48305. Curiously, both engines can be seen wearing a Douglas nameplate, though I think the intention is one of them is supposed to be Donald. We have Diesel, not played by a Class 08, but instead the similar looking Class 10, number D4067. This engine entered preservation in 1980 under a private owner, and made their debut at the Great Central as late as 2009. Strangely, his face is seen on the back of its cab as opposed to its front, but this is likely because it'd be obscured when pushing a train. Daisy made their debut as late as 2009, portrayed by the Class 101 DMUs number 50321 and 51427. This is very appropriate as Daisy is a Class 101, albeit a single car unit. Even with the multiple cars, I'll still count this as an accurate engine. You can also find Diesel 199 appearing at an event. They are played by the Class 45 number D123 and came to the railway in 1998. The engine initially arrived in character-accurate BR blue, but by the time of their debut in 2002, they had been painted into green. And as far as I'm aware, this was the only year they played the character. And then we have Arthur, portrayed by the Fairburn 4MT number 42085. This engine is normally based on the Lakeside and Haverwaith Railway, but around 2009, the engine could be found at the Great Central. This railway uses a Fowler 3F, also known as a Ginty, to portray their Thomas, specifically number 47327. You've probably seen this engine appear on other railways, as this is one of several engines that is lent out for Thomas events. They joined the railway in 1970 and was transformed into the character by 2007. They last ran as Thomas in 2012, after which they returned to their black livery. Their Percy is played by the M5 Peckett number 1163 Whitehead. They arrived at the Midlands in 1999 and debuted as Percy as late as 2011. Diesel is played by number 08590, a Class 08 that carried the name Red Lion. The engine was in service up until 1993 and eventually found its way to the Midland in preservation. They started appearing as Diesel as late as 2011 and held the role at least through 2015. And since they are a Class 08, we can add another accurate engine to the counter. Daisy first appeared as late as 1995, played by the Class 114s numbers 56006 and 50019. They had joined the railway only a few years prior and held the role at most till 2007, as another set had started to appear. This was a set of Class 127s, comprising of numbers 51591, 59609, and 51625. The set joined the railway in the 90s, debuting as late as 2007 and held the role until 2012. And Mavis is played by the Class 02, number D2858. They were preserved by the railway in 2002 and started making appearances as late as 2007. Huntsman number 686, the Lady Armagdale, holds the mantle of Thomas at this railway. Previously being painted in a bright red livery, they were transformed into Thomas throughout 1993 and debuted the following year. 686 ran as Thomas for about 6 years before having to be withdrawn due to issues with its boiler. In its stead, the railway's Ginty number 47383 took over the role, being painted from black to blue. They only played Thomas from 2000 to 2002, as by that point the Lady Armagdale was back in action. After taking back the role, they would continue to appear as Thomas until 2009, when boiler issues once again took them out of service. Nowadays, the engine can be found on static display in its original red livery. The railway is also home to an LMS Stanier Black 5 number 45110 that would play Henry. 45110 started appearing as Henry as late as the year 2000 and would keep the role at least through 2003, but no later than 2008, as that is when it was withdrawn for overhaul. In 2012, the railway had the Stanier Mogul number 13268 take over the role, though I believe this was the only year it did so. We have Gordon appearing in 1992, and he is quite fittingly portrayed by LMR number 600 Gordon. Despite what you think, its name and color are completely unrelated from the character. The engine is named after a British general, and the livery is standard among LMR engines. Percy is played by Peckett number 1738, a former resident of the Severn Valley until being sold to the South Devon in 95. 1738 returned to the railway around 1999, where it debuted as Percy. Duck is played by Great Western 5700 Panniers numbers 5764, who joined the railway in 1971, and 7714, who joined in 1973. I believe 5764 debuted first, with it appearing as Duck as late as 1992, and by the year 2000, 7714 had taken over the role. Diesel is yet again played by Class 08, number D3022, who arrived on the railway in 1983 and debuted as late as 1992. Daisy is played by a pair of Class 108s that debuted as late as 2006. The set was initially made of numbers 51935 and 56208, however in 2008, 51935 was irreparably damaged in an arson attack, and was replaced with numbers 50933 from the Dean Forest Railway. And with this, we can add 4 more engines to the counter, with Henry, Diesel, and the 2 Ducks. This is our first narrow gauge railway, and they actually held their first Thomas event fairly recently. Their Thomas is played by W.G. Bagnall number 3023, Isaac. Previously, they worked in South Africa, hauling ore from a platinum mine, doing this for almost 20 years. The engine found its way to the Statfold in 2021 and debuted as Thomas in 2025. James is played by Hudswell Clark number 972, Fiji. The engine previously worked in Fiji hauling wagons of sugarcane. It came to the railway in 2012 and debuted in 2025. Percy is portrayed by Peckett number 2050, Harrogate. It received its name from the Harrogate Gasworks that it worked at until 1956. Harrogate joined the railway in 2003 and debuted as Percy in 2025. And lastly, we have Rosie, portrayed by Ornstein and Koppel number 10750, Max. This German-built engine worked at the Sagri sugar mill in Indonesia until coming to the Statfold in 2003. And in 2025, it received significant cosmetic changes to appear as Rosie. Percy is portrayed by the Hunza Austerity Saddle Tank number 3879, Holwyn. Initially being built for the War Department, they eventually found their way into the service of collieries, and later joined the Gwilly in 1996. They debuted as Percy as late as 2010, and held the role until the last event in 2012. Daisy is played by a set of Class 117s, made up of numbers 51347, 59508, and 51401. They joined the railway in 2009 and debuted that same year. And Mavis is portrayed by the Class 03, number D2178. They joined the railway in 1983, being relegated to pilot duties, and debuted as late as 2012. We have now reached the first of many railways that have directly inspired a location from the books, in this case the Skarloey Railway. From what I can tell, Skarloey appeared fairly late compared to the other engines. The first Skarloey engine showed up on the railway in the 1980s, and Skarloey didn't debut until 2012. They are played by their twin, Talyklyn, and initially debuted without a face on his smokebox, only carrying his name on their tanks. Skarloey would reappear in 2015, now wearing a face, and would make several appearances moving forward. Rheneas could be found as late as 2009, portrayed by their counterpart Dol Guk. They similarly debuted with only a nameplate, and would gain a face at a later date. Sir Handel was actually the first visitor on the Talyklyn, debuting in 1982, being portrayed by number 3, Sir Hayden. Sir Handel remained on the railway for about 2 years, and on one special day got to meet Wilbur and Christopher Audrey. The events of his stay were mentioned in the 29th Railway Series book, Great Little Engines. He left in '84, but would make several returns to the railway in later years. In fact, in a recent visit, Sir Handel got to meet Sir Hayden. In 2024, the Corus Railway's newly built Falcon came to the railway under the guise of Sir Handel, and ran trains alongside their twin. This makes Sir Handel one of the only engines to have met their counterpart. The reception to Sir Handel's first visit was so positive that the railway was committed to hosting a Skarloey engine every season. Peter Sam was the next engine to debut in 1998. The railway's number 4, Edward Thomas, was dressed as Peter Sam for a duration of 12 years. Like Sir Handel, they also got to meet their creator, and the events of their visit were mentioned in a book, New Little Engines. Peter Sam was relieved of duty in the year 2000, but would make occasional returns every now and then. One such visit had him played by his core sibling number 7 when they visited the railway in 2011. I couldn't, however, find evidence that Peter Sam and Edward Thomas ever met despite both being on the railway at the same time. Rusty the Little Diesel is played by the Talyklyn's Midlander and debuted as late as 2001. Midlander's design is slightly different from Rusty's, as they were rebuilt in 1980 to accommodate a new engine when their previous one failed. Rusty never received this rebuild, so his appearance here is technically inaccurate, but since it is his real-life basis, he will still add towards the counter. In the year 2000, Duncan would take over as the Talyklyn's Skarloey representation. They were portrayed by their counterpart Douglas, and had their outings branded as Duncan Days. Duncan stayed until 2008, as they were due for an overhaul, but would reappear on display in 2012. They'd be pulling trains again by the next year, though at the time their repairs weren't complete, so they had to be assisted by Rusty. Duncan would stop consistently appearing after 2015, when Peter Sam took back the role of the main Skarloey engine. This also saw the rebranding of Duncan Days to Peter Sam's Party. Fred, the lesser-known diesel, appeared the latest of all the engines, at Audrey Extravaganza 2022. Fred is played by the Talyklyn's number 9, Alf, who is their real-life bassist. However, since Fred was never illustrated in the books, we have to assume that this is what he would have looked like. And the railway's youngest engine, Ivo Hugh, would make their debut in 2012, played by their counterpart, Tom Rolt. There have also been appearances by the TV-exclusive character Smudger, first played by Edward Thomas during Audrey Extravaganza 2022, and then by Dol Guk in 2023. And since nearly all the engines are played by their respective counterparts, that adds a total of 11 accurate engines to the counter. We're not finished with the Skarloey Railway just yet, as their final engine makes an appearance here. Duke the Lost Engine has been portrayed by two of the railway's small England classes, number 2 Prince and number 4 Palmerston. Judging by this picture, Prince debuted first, showing up between 1995 and 1997. Here it has the brass smokebox handrail it gained in 95, and it's wearing its original red livery with the black cab that it'd have until being overhauled in 97. When it went to be overhauled, that is presumably when Palmerston took over the role. The Festiniog stopped hosting events around the mid-2000s, but Palmerston would get another chance to play Duke when it was invited to the Talyklyn in 2025 for the Audrey Extravaganza. This would add another 2 engines to the counter. This railway is home to 2 Thomas replicas. The first is the Fowler 3F number 47298, another Ginty that tours around other railways. The engine joined the railway in 1983 and debuted as Thomas in 2003. They would hold the role until 2012, when it was sold to the East Lancashire. The second Thomas is Hunslet number 1873 Jesse. Jessie was originally built as a saddle tank and spent most of its life at Eastmoor Steelworks. It arrived at the Clongauchlin in 1998 and in 2008 was rebuilt into Thomas to cover for 47298 who was out of service at the time. It fully took over as the character when 47298 left the railway, and it remained like this until 2019 when it was converted back to a saddle tank. In addition to the two Thomases, there are also two Ducks, Great Western Railway Panniers number 7754 and 6430. 7754 is the more accurate of the two, being a 5700. They joined the railway in the early 90s and debuted as the character in 1994. 6430 is a 6400 class that joined the railway in 1996 and debuted as late as 2007. The LMS Black 5 number 44806 can interestingly be found playing Douglas rather than the obvious choice of Henry. I have to assume that this is because it's painted in black. They joined the railway in 1993 and can be found playing the character as late as 2003, and they would continue to play the role until 2013 when it was sold to the North York Moors Railway. Filling the role of Diesel, we have number 13265, a Class 08 formerly based in Cardiff. They arrived on the Clongauchlin around 1983 and debuted as the character as late as 2014. Daisy debuted as late as 2004 and is played by a number of DMUs. This set consists of a pair of Class 108s, numbers 51907 and 56490, a pair of Class 104s, numbers 50454 and 50528, as well as a Class 127, number 51618, and a Class 105, number 56454. The set would remain the same until 2010, when the Class 105 would be withdrawn for an overhaul, and the Class 108, number 56223, would be loaned to the railway from the East Anglian to replace the missing unit. And with that, we can add two more engines to the counter for Duck and Diesel. Here, we have another example of an engine being rebuilt to play Thomas. Number 7031 Pen Green was a Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne saddle tank that previously worked in Corby. It arrived at the museum in 1973, and during an overhaul in 2007, it was transformed into Thomas. It would then tour around other railways, including one in the Netherlands. Percy and Toby are also present at the museum, with Percy being portrayed by W.G. Bagnall number 2542 Jubilee. They worked at the Bowaters paper mill for about 40 years until they were moved to the museum in 1976. Jubilee debuted as the character as late as 2011, running in their standard dark green livery. They'd appear like this until 2016, when they'd received Percy's green paint and red stripes. It's very appropriate that they would have Toby here, considering in the Railway series continuity, East Anglia is where he was based before arriving on Sodor. This replica was built from a John Fowler diesel, numbered 4220039, and it debuted as late as 2010. It's actually a pretty convincing replica, further improved by the addition of Henrietta. Daisy is the last engine of note, and is portrayed by the Class 101's numbers 51213 and 56358. The pair joined the railway in 2003, and debuted as the character as late as 2006. And since they are Class 101s, this gives us another accurate engine to add to the count. Here, we have Percy portrayed by several different engines. The Hunza Austerity number 190 would debut first. They were built for the War Department in 1952 and joined the Colne in 1971, making their debut as the character as late as 2006. The following year, 190 would be withdrawn for overhaul and replaced with number 1875 Barrington, a D-Class Avonside locomotive. These two would take turns playing the character, with one filling in whenever the other was unavailable. Apart from these two, there would be one more engine to take up the role. Barclay number 1931 could be found playing Percy in 2017. They are normally based on the Rutland Railway Museum, and during their visit to the Colne was dressed as the character. Moving on, the railway had a diesel for a brief stint in 2009. The Class 08 number 08915 Longsight portrayed the character while it was visiting from the North Tyneside Steam Railway. Daisy first started appearing around 2003, being portrayed by the Class 121 number 55033. It joined the railway in 1995 and for a while ran as a single unit, which is more accurate to Daisy. But in 2004, the railway acquired number 56287 and added them to the train. This new unit would remain on the railway until 2017, leaving 55033 to run the last few events as a single unit. And finishing things out, they have number D2184, a Class 03 playing Mavis. They joined the railway in 1986, and by 2002 could be found masquerading as the character, complete with side plates and Farquhar Quarry lettering. And as much as I want to call it an accurate engine, it isn't an 04, so I can't count it. I can, however, add Diesel for being a Class 08. At this museum, you can find a Toby replica running on their narrow gauge railway. This Toby debuted as late as 2005. It was converted from Monorail Simplex number 22210. Thomas events at the railway stopped around 2012, and sometime after that, the engine was placed on static display. On the standard gauge part of the museum, you can also find Daisy, played by the Class 101 number 56347. They joined the railway in 2005 and debuted as the character as late as 2007, although it saw more use as a coach than an engine. Being a steam museum, the Diesel saw little use and could often be found being pulled by a steam engine when extra capacity was required. That being said, it is a Class 101, giving us another accurate engine. We at last get an accurate Mavis, as the museum was host to the Class 04 number 11103. The engine formerly worked on the Wisbech and Upwell tramway, which explains why it has side plates and cowcatchers. They were preserved by the Emsby and Bolton Abbey Railway in 1989, and during a visit to the Bressingham in 2011, they debuted as Mavis. This gives us another accurate engine to add to the count. Thomas is played by the railway's number 1 Workstrom Broad. This engine was built in 1964 and worked on the Fairborn Railway under the name Tracy Joe. They were originally built as a petrol engine, and when they arrived on the Burr Valley in 1992, they were rebuilt as a steam engine. It was also around this time that Workstrom would debut as Thomas. Joining Thomas at his debut was James, portrayed by Guest Engineering and Maintenance number 4 Cyan. This engine also worked at the Fairborn Railway until being sold to the Burr Valley in 1991. They wouldn't play James for very long, as by 1994 they were sold to volunteers of the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway, and since then have visited various railways. We have yet another Toby, this one being made from a Lister diesel. The engine originally worked on the Fisson's 2 feet gauge Peat Railway until 1979. When it joined the Burr Valley, the engine was re-gauged to 15 inches and made their debut as Toby as late as 2001. They'd maintained the role at least through 2011, and by 2016 would be reverted back to their original look. And then there is Rusty, portrayed by a Hudson Hunslet shunter. This engine joined the railway in 1993 and debuted as Rusty as late as 2001. I can't find many pictures of it, but they originally looked like this with slanted sides and were rebuilt around 2004, taking on a more boxy shape. Jumping back to standard gauge, here you can find Henry, portrayed by the LNER B12 number 8572. They joined the railway in 1995, debuting as Henry in 2013 and maintaining the role up until 2018. Hunslet number 1982, Ha Ring, previously played Percy at the 2014 event, but wouldn't reprise its role in later years as the engine was loaned to other railways. It was subsequently replaced by Bagnall's Jubilee, who we previously discussed. They also have Donald and Douglas, played by a Great Eastern Class Y14 number 564. They debuted as late as 2013, first appearing in LNER Black and then in Great Eastern Blue following their overhaul. It's quite fitting that the engine was able to portray both liveries that the characters wore. Quite surprisingly, we have an appearance from Murdoch, played by the BR9F number 92203, dubbed Black Prince. Murdoch is one of those characters that didn't really catch on, so it's quite nice to see him make an appearance and as an accurate representation. They would first come to the railway on loan in 2010, but would officially join the railway in 2015 and debut as the character that same year. Diesel is played by the Class 08 number D3940 and the Class 11 number 12131. 3940 joined the railway sometime after 1994 and debuted as Diesel as late as 2007, while 12131 joined in 1982 and debuted as late as 2013. It appears that the two would take turns playing Diesel, with the rogue likely going to whichever was available at the time. Daisy is played by the Class 101s number 51192 and 56352. The pair debuted in 2014, acting as the coaches for Thomas's train. Daisy would make an appearance at every event following this, although 51192 would have to be withdrawn in 2018 and was subsequently replaced with number 51188. And then there's Bear, played by the Class 31 number D5631. They joined the railway in 2003 and would debut as the character in 2013. And with Diesel, Daisy, and Murdoch using their real-life bases, that adds 3 more engines to the counter. Here, Henry was played by the engine Southern Maid, a miniature Pacific loco that's been on the railway since it opened in 1927. They debuted as the character as late as 2008 and held the role until the Romney's final event in 2012. Gordon was played by the engine Hurricane, another miniature Pacific that also joined in 2007. They debuted in the late 90s and would hold the role until 2012. Most of the engines on the Romney are based on the designs of Sir Nigel Gressley's A1 Pacifics, essentially making them miniature Flying Scotsmans. This would technically make Hurricane an accurate Gordon, but since they are not actual A1s, I'm not going to count them. And Toby, as you might expect, is a Diesel with a J70 outline, and in this case is played by Lister. Here, Percy is played by the Hunslet Austerity Saddle Tank number 191. They were built for the War Department in 1952 and carried the name Black Knight. They were eventually sold to the Kenton East Sussex in 1974, where they would gain the name Holman F. Stevens. And by 1993, they could be found playing Percy. Around this time, they had number 1638, a Great Western 1600 pannier, debut as Duck. 1638 joined the railway in 1992, and after its debut would continue to make appearances at least through 2018. They also have an engine portraying Donald and Douglas, the Norwegian loco number 376. They were a former resident of the Norwegian State Railway and made their way to the K&E in 1971, making their debut as the characters as late as 2014. Quite fittingly, like Donald and Douglas, 376 also did work clearing the line of snow back in Norway. Daisy is portrayed by a pair of Class 108s, numbers 50971 and 51571. They joined the railway in 1993 and made their debut as late as 2010. You can also find Mavis played by the Class 03, number D2023. They entered preservation on the railway in 1983 and started making appearances as Mavis in 2011. And finishing things out, we have Rosie, portrayed by the S100 Class number 65, Monsell. They joined the railway in 1968 and started appearing as Rosie as late as 2011. Monsell has actually been playing a train with a face at least since the year 2000, but was not identified as Rosie until after her TV debut in 2006. Regardless, this is another accurate engine to add to the count. This railway's Percy is played by number 1636, Fanman. They are a B2 class picket that was formerly based at a cement works. It joined the railway in 1994 and debuted as Percy as late as 2002. Fanman likely kept the role until 2009 when its boiler ticket expired, but by this point the railway had acquired a suitable replacement. In 2007, the Spa Valley purchased number 7673, Ugly, of the class of the same name. It re-entered service in 2010, the year after Fanman was withdrawn, so it is likely that this is when it debuted as Percy. We have another 5700 portraying Duck. In this instance, it's number 7715, a loaned engine from the Buckinghamshire Railway Centre. They came to the railway in 2008 and debuted as late as 2010, and as far as I can tell, this was the only year they played the character. There's Diesel being played by the Class 12, number 15224. They joined the railway in 1998 and can be found appearing as Diesel as late as 2007, and they'd maintained the role at least through 2010. By 2015, the Class 10, number D3489, took over the role, and likely held it until the railway took a hiatus from Thomas in 2018. The Class 101, number 56408, could be found playing Daisy as late as 2015. They joined the railway in 2004, and while they were briefly paired with the Class 115 for testing purposes, at events they ran as a single unit, being paired up with Thomas and Diesel as their coach. Boko started showing up around 2015, and is played by a variety of Diesels. The Class 25, number D7612, was the first engine to take up the role. This engine was preserved by the East Lancashire Railway in 1989 and was sold to the South Devon in 1999. In 2015, the engine visited the Spa Valley and made an appearance as Boko. This was the only time they played the character, as by next year another engine had taken over the role. The Class 33, number 33202, Dennis G. Robinson, was the next engine to take over the role in 2016. This engine would enter preservation in 2009 and would spend some time at the Spa Valley from 2014 to 2016 before being moved to the Mid-Norfolk. It was during its last year on the railway that they would debut as Boko. Number 33063 RJ Mitchell was the last engine to play Boko at the railway. They are also Class 33 and joined the railway in 2002, debuting as the character as late as 2017. And lastly, we have Mavis, portrayed by Drury number 2591 Sutherham. This is one of the railway's first engines that they acquired in preservation, and they debuted as late as 2005 and are still making appearances as of 2025. And with Daisy and Duck using their real-life bases, that adds 2 more accurate engines to the counter. Now, I've generally been trying to list the characters in the order they appear in the show, but for this one, I think I'll start with the engine everyone's expecting. Stepney is an LB and SCR A1X class tank engine, commonly referred to as a Terrier, and is one of the few real-life engines that was made into a character in the books. Stepney joined the railway in 1960, and only 3 years later would debut in the Railway series. It was then in 1977 that Stepney would don his Railway series look to capitalize on the book's popularity. Stepney's new look brought many children to the railway, essentially starting their own Thomas event. They'd wear this look on and off for many years, and as of 2025, this is how they appear on static display. Years later, the railway would get the opportunity to properly host Thomas events, bringing on more Sodor engines. Their Percy is a loaned engine from the Gwilly Steam Railway, a Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne designed number 7058 Olwen. Olwen debuted in 2002, however it was experiencing mechanical issues the week of the event and had to be assisted by number 3135 Invincible. Olwen, in much better condition, would continue to reprise his role as Percy up until 2008, when the Bluebells ceased Day Out with Thomas. In 2006, the railway hired their first diesel, the Class 08 number D3023, to help with work on the East Grinstead extension. This was apparently a controversial decision for many of the supporters, but it was necessary to keep the steam engines in working order. The same year they arrived, they would debut as Diesel, and would remain on the railway until 2008. They have Fergus, portrayed by his real-life bases, Aveling and Porter number 9449, the Blue Circle. This engine was previously owned by the Bluebell, and in 1997 was sold to the Buckinghamshire Railway Centre. In 2004, the engine would return to the Bluebell and debut as Fergus, and after this event would appear as the character on other railways. Arthur is played by the BR Standard 4 number 80151, who debuted as the character likely around 2003. Unfortunately, Arthur can't be counted as an accurate engine, as his basis is the similar looking IVAT 2MT. We can, however, add Stepney, Diesel, and Fergus to the count. The only engine of note here is that of Mavis, played by the Class 03 number D2059, Edward. They joined the railway in 1988 and debuted as late as 2010. This Mavis is actually quite detailed, having her wasp stripes, name, and lettering, though this is still an 03, so I won't be adding it to the count. Thomas first debuted in 1996 and was played by a Maxi-Trax Simplicity 2 Diesel. This was a kit-built engine made for miniature railways. It seems the railway purchased the kit and built a Thomas shell around it. This Thomas didn't hold the role very long though, as by 1999 another engine had replaced this one. This Thomas borrows the chassis from the diesel hydraulic engine Florence. They would appear normal for most of the year and would swap body shells for Day Out with Thomas. With the railway ceasing Thomas events in 2018, Thomas was permanently given Florence's chassis and repainted to remove the likeness to Thomas. Florence, meanwhile, was rebuilt into an electric engine, gaining a new body shell and powered bogies. Henry is played by number 1002, the Empress. This engine has had quite an interesting life, starting its career running on Cookson's private railway, then being moved to the Foxhill line. After that, it was re-gauged to 9¼ inches and moved to the Spring Lane Railway. It ran on Dawson's Park during World War II, and after changing hands several more times, it eventually joined the Eastleigh Lakeside Railway in 2001, debuting as Henry as late as 2006. Then we have Gordon, played by number 1001, the Monarch. The Monarch joined the railway in 1994, and after a rebuild, debuted as Gordon alongside Thomas in 1996. It was during this rebuild that the Monarch was explicitly painted to resemble Gordon. At this time, the Monarch was gauged to 7¼ inches, but in 2001 it was returned to its original gauge of 10¼ inches. This is probably the most interesting railway on this list, purely because of the amount of engines they have and the lengths they go to portray them. Number 679 Hamburg was the first engine to play Thomas on the railway. This is a Hudswell Clark standard short tank that was visiting from the Keighley and Worth. Hamburg debuted in 1993, the first year the Mid-Hanse held the event, and they would only appear at this first event as the railway would gain their own Thomas locomotive the following year. After the success of the first event, it was decided that they would have their own Thomas, and so the Hansa Austerity number 3781 Linde was rebuilt to resemble Thomas and debuted at the 1994 event. Linde was specifically rebuilt to be the most authentic version of Thomas at the time, gaining his extended side tanks, the dip in his running board, and his light blue livery. This has pretty much become the UK's de facto Thomas, making appearances at several railways across the country. Henry debuted around 1995 and was played by the Standard 5 number 73096. It acted as Henry for about 16 years before being withdrawn in 2011 when its boiler ticket expired. Fortunately, the previous year, their Black 5 number 45379 had completed their restoration and would take over the role in 73096 instead. They would hold the role until 2018 when their boiler ticket expired. Gordon has only made one appearance at the railway in 2013. Here, he was played by number 60163, Tornado, the new A1 Pacific built only a few years prior by the A1 Steam Trust. Tornado has worn a couple different liveries, but it's quite fitting that it was in BR Express Blue for this event. Now James is really interesting, as the railways had 3 different engines portray him. The first James debuted in 1993 and was played by the N-Class number 31874. Previously resting at Barry Island Scrapyard, it was brought to the Mid-Hanse in '74, where it was restored to working condition. The story goes that by the early 90s, 31874 was in need of an overhaul, and someone had the idea to dress the engine as James and host a Thomas weekend to fund the repairs. 31874 ran as James until 1995, when it swapped boilers with the Mansell U-Class number 31625, who subsequently took over the role. 31625 was also a former resident of Barry Island, and joined the Mid-Hanse in 1980. It debuted as James in 1996 and would last as James until 2001 due to an issue with its boiler. For a time, both engines could be found sitting derelict on a siding, leaving the Mid-Hanse without a James for a number of years. It wasn't until 2012 that the railway would get another James. Number 31806, another U-Class, joined the railway in 1976, and after several decades of being overhauled, it re-entered service in 2011, debuting as James the following year, although it was not painted up like the other engines. 31806 would last as James until 2014, when it, along with 31874 and 31625, were transferred to the Swanage Railway. 31806 is still running on the railway, while the latter two are in the process of being restored. Prior to playing Thomas, Linde first debuted as Percy in 1993, and would only last the 1 year as Linde was converted to play Thomas in 1994. It was then, in 2008, that the newly restored Teddy, visiting from the Lavender Line Heritage Railway, would take up the role of Percy. Teddy is a Peckett number 2012, and was formerly owned by the Reverend Teddy Boston, a longtime friend of Reverend Audrey. They'd appear as Percy again the following year, but this would be the last time they'd play the character. Duck also made an appearance at the first event in 1993. It was played by the 5700 class number 7760, visiting from the Severn Valley, and like several other engines, this was its only appearance. Another Duck would appear on the railway in 2021, played by number 4612, visiting from the bottom in Winford. Douglas made his first appearance in 1993, being played by the S15 class number 30506. It would maintain the role until 2001, when it was withdrawn for overhaul, and it was subsequently replaced with a custom-built engine. Number 2890 was a Hansa Austerity that joined the railway in 1990, and was rebuilt to play Douglas around the year 2000. This rebuild saw its conversion from a saddle tank to a tender engine, and had parts of its tenders sourced from an LMS Fowler. 2890 would keep the role until 2012, when it was moved to the Ribble Steam Railway. The railway has also had a number of engines playing diesel, the first of which debuted in 1993. This was the Class 08 number 08288, the railway's first diesel that helped rebuild the line in preservation. For a while, they were the only engine playing diesel, but the railway would eventually bring on more engines that would take over the role. The Class 08 number 08032 would arrive in 2009, and the Class 11 number 12082 would arrive in 2010. The role of diesel would be frequently traded among the engines, and at times you could find all the engines playing the character at once. Daisy debuted in the year 2000, played by the Class 122 number 55003. It initially ran as a single unit, but later had a set of Class 117s added on for more capacity. 55003 would leave the railway in 2011, after being sold to the Gloucestershire-Warwickshire Railway. In 2013, they would have the Hampshire unit number 1125 take up the role of Daisy. However, as far as I can tell, this was the only year they did so. Mavis showed up one year, played by the Class 03 number 03197. This engine was based on the Mangaps Railway and was loaned out to the Mid-Hands in 2018. It would only appear this one time as it was moved to the Mid-Norfolk Railway the next year. We've got an appearance from Diesel 199, played by the Class 45 number 45132. They joined the railway in 1992 and debuted as the character around 1995. It would keep the role into the year 2000 when, much like D199, its engine failed and it had to be withdrawn. The Class 40 Diesel also made an appearance in 2015, played by the Class 37 number D6836. As far as I can tell, this was its only appearance as the character. Murdoch would also appear, played by the BR9F number 92212. It arrived on the railway around 2006 for an overhaul, and soon after was bought and based on the railway. Its overhaul was completed in 2010, and would debut as the character that same year, appearing on and off for the next several events. And lastly, we have Spencer, played by the A4 Pacific number 60019 Bittern. They arrived on the railway in 2001 to be overhauled, being completed in 2007 and debuting as Spencer the next year. The engine has since re-entered mainline service, pulling various rail tours, but it would reprise its role as the character when it returned to the railway in 2015. I wasn't kidding when I said this railway had a lot of engines, and with Henry, Gordon, Duck, Diesel, Murdoch, and Spencer, that adds 8 more accurate engines to the counter. There are actually a couple candidates for Percy here. First is Great Western Railway number 1338, a Kitston saddle tank that joined the railway in 1987 and debuted as late as 2011. We then have Great Western Railway number 1340 Trojan, a saddle tank built by Avonside that joined the railway in 1968 and debuted as early as 2002. Now, Percy doesn't have a real-life basis, but many fans like to consider these two as potential candidates. Moving on, we also have number 7544, Bonnie Prince Charlie, a Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne design that joined the railway in 1969 and likely debuted around the 2000s. Lastly, there is Hudswell Clark number 1026, Sir Robert McAlpine and Sons. This engine was owned by Sir William McAlpine, who you may know as the man who saved Flying Scotsman after its infamous trip to the United States. The engine is based on the Folly Hill Railway and made a visit to the Didcot in 2020 masquerading as Percy. Duck has been played by the Great Western Panniers number 3738 and 3650. 3738 debuted first in 2007, with 3650 debuting the following year. The two would take turns playing the character until 2013, when 3738 was withdrawn due to issues with its firebox, leaving 3650 as the railway's sole duck until it was withdrawn in 2016. Oliver is portrayed by the Great Western Auto Tank number 1466. They joined the railway in 1967 and debuted as late as 1997. 1466 did most of its appearances on static display, as it was withdrawn in the year 2000 and didn't start its overhaul until 2018. Diesel is played by the Class 08 number 08604 Phantom. They joined the railway in 1994 and would debut as late as 2008. And lastly, we have Salty, played by the Class 14 number D9516. This engine joined the railway in 2014 and debuted as the character that same year. So, with the two Ducks, Oliver, and Diesel, we can add 4 more accurate engines to the count. Our first Thomas is North British number 24564, Coventry number 1. It is a Nielsen redesign that joined the railway in 1971 and debuted as late as 1991, with one of its first appearances being in the Japan-exclusive special Thomas in the UK trip. Coventry held the role of Thomas until about 2016, when its boiler ticket expired. Since then, it's been reverted back to its original dark blue livery and placed on static display. Taking over for Coventry was number 3782 Arthur, a Hunslet saddle tank that joined the railway in 1979. The engine sat in storage for many years, until 2016 when it was pulled out to be converted into Thomas. After the overhaul, Arthur debuted at the Buckinghamshire's 2024 Thomas event. Percy is played by Peckett number 2105, Rockaby, a fellow class member of number 2104 who played Percy at the Northampton and Lamport Railway. Rockaby came to the railway in 1972 and became operational in 2002. The earliest I could find it debuting as Percy was in 2006, and it would maintain the role until being placed on static display in 2016. They would then have number 1742 Milam, a Hudswell Clark design, take up the role in 2017, and as of 2025, it is still running as Percy. Mavis is the last engine of note here, and is played by number D2298. They joined the railway in 1982, and debuted as late as 1991, holding the role until it left the railway in 2017. Now since they are a Class 04, we can add another accurate engine to the counter. Here you can find Henry being played by the modified Hall class number 7903, 4 Mark Hall. They joined the railway in 2004, after completing its restoration the previous year. They debuted as Henry in 2011 and held the role until the railway's final event in 2018. 4 Mark Hall was out of service between 2014 and 2016, and so during that time they had number 2807 take over the role. They are a 2800 class that joined the railway in 1981. The engine was restored in 2010 and debuted as Henry in 2014. In 2013, Captain Nathaniel Darrell, the Class 08 numbered 08484, briefly portrayed Diesel while on a visit to the railway. And with it being a Class 08, we can add another accurate engine to the count. Daisy is played by a set of Class 117s, the same set that was added to 55005 at the Mid-Hants Railway. The set consists of numbers 51363, 59510, and 51405, who were sold to the Gloucestershire in 2011 and debuted as Daisy around 2013. They would keep the role until 2018, when the Gloucestershire ceased Dale with Thomas event. Mavis is portrayed by Drury number 11230 in the Class 03 number D2182. 11230 took up the role first, joining the railway in 2003 and debuting as late as 2011. 2182 joined around the 1990s and debuted as late as 2014. And as far as I can tell, the two would take turns playing the character. Here Percy is played by Peckett number 2147, Uskmouth 1, who interestingly was never in Steam as the character. Uskmouth came to the railway in 1972, but sat in storage as a major overhaul was required. Around 2010, Uskmouth could be found on Stag Display dressed as Percy, and it would appear like this for several years. They would eventually Steam again in 2024, but by this point the railway had stopped hosting the event. Doc also appears, played by the 8750 class pannier number 9681. The engine was withdrawn from BR service in 1965 and sat at Barry Island for nearly 10 years. It was rescued from scrap by the Dean Forest in 75 and would debut as Duck as late as 2006, holding the role until it was withdrawn in 2013. Diesel first debuted in the 1990s. They were played by number 08377, a Class 08 that the railway preserved in 1986. They held the role at most through 1996, when it was moved to the West Somerset, but it would get a chance to reprise its role when it was moved to the Mid-Hants in 2013. They were then followed up by number 13308, Charlie. They debuted as late as 2006 and would keep the role until 2013, when number D3937, Gladys, took over the role, holding it until the railway's last event in 2019. Daisy is actually played by two sets of Class 108s, the first set comprising of 56492 and 50619, and the second of 51914, 51566, and 59387. Daisy debuted as late as 1998 and was first played by 492 and 619. The other units would join the railway at different times, but depending on what was available and how busy they would combine the different units together, even running all 5 for the 2014 event. Here, we have another example of a real engine playing their book counterpart. Wilbert is a 100 Austerity saddle tank built for the National Coal Board in 1953. It joined the railway in 1976, becoming the Dean Forest first locomotive in preservation. The engine received the name Wilbert in honor of the Reverend Wilbert Audrey, who was the railway's president at the time. Wilbert would make his Railway Series debut in 1994 with the book Wilbert the Forest Engine, but the character actually predates the book, with Wilbert gaining a face for the 1990 Thomas event. And of course, because this is the actual engine, Wilbert will add towards the counter, along with the 3 diesels. Wilbert would continue to make appearances until 2016, when it was withdrawn in need of repairs. Due to financial issues, Wilbert's overhaul was put on hold, and it sat on a siding for a number of years. Fortunately, in celebration of the Railway Series' 80th anniversary, the railway, in collaboration with Accurascale, held a charity sale of 00 Wilberts, with all the proceeds going to cosmetically restore the real engine. The last engine here is Salty, played by the Hunslet number 6688, Salty. They joined the railway in 2009 and was given its name due to its resemblance to the character. Salty debuted as late as 2010 and would maintain the role until they ceased Thomas events. Daisy is played by a pair of Class 107s, numbers 52006 and 52025. They were based on the Emsey and Bolton Abbey Railway and loaned to the Avon in 2008. They debuted as the character the following year and presumably held the role until their final event in 2013. We have another Salty here, and this one is the real deal. Salty debuted as late as 2009 and is played by the Class 07 number 2994. The Class 07 is of course Salty's real-life basis, and 2994 is only 3 numbers removed from Salty's, which is 2991. And with this being the case, we'll add Salty to the count. The R3 class peck at Kilmersdon could be found playing Percy starting in 2002. They joined the railway in 1983, and after debuting would maintain the role until the West Somerset's last event in 2016. But they would get a chance to reprise their role when they were moved to the Mid-Hants Railway. Duck is played by number 6412, a 6400 class pannier that arrived on the railway in 1976. They would debut in 2002 and would maintain the role until it was sold to the South Devon in 2009. Daisy is played by a set of Class 115s, comprising of numbers 51880, 59678, and 51859. The set was formed in the early 90s and debuted as the character in 2002, holding the role until 2016. The next engines we'll look at are the China Clay twins Bill and Ben. The pair is played by the W.G. Bagnall saddle tanks Alfred and Judy, who had come up from the bottom in Winford Railway. Alfred, being the first of the two preserved, debuted first in 2002 as Ben wearing a Soder China Clay inspired livery. Judy didn't enter preservation until 2002 and required extensive repairs once preserved. It wouldn't join its twin until 2009, where it debuted as Bill. Mavis is played by the Class 03 number D2133. They joined the railway in 1994 and debuted in 2002. Then we have Bear, portrayed by the Class 35 number D7017. This engine joined the railway in the 1970s and made their debut in 2010, cleverly being renumbered to Bear's number D7101. They wouldn't last long though, as it seems they would only hold the role until 2011. So with that, we can add 3 more to the counter for Bill, Ben, and Bear. For their Thomas, the South Devon borrowed an engine from the North York Moors Railway, specifically number 31 Meteor. They debuted around 1994, but for the life of me, I can't find any footage of this event. The most I could find was its appearance at the 1994 Exeter Rail Fair. After debuting, Meteor would hold the role at least until 96. Duck was portrayed by the 5700 class number 5786. They formerly worked for the London Underground under the number L92 and joined the railway in 1993. They debuted as Duck as late as 2005 and held the role at least through 2015. After this, the engine was frequently loaned out to other railways. In their absence, the South Devon had number 6412, who we just discussed, take over the role. Diesel is played by the Class 09 number 3721. They joined the railway in 2010 as a replacement for number D3666, whose restoration was proving to be quite expensive. After some repairs, they re-entered service in 2011 and debuted as the character in 2013, and they can still be found playing Diesel as of 2025. We then have Oliver, aptly played by the 1400 class number 1420, named Bulliver. Bulliver is considered to be the real-life Oliver, since its number can be faintly seen on Oliver in his book, suggesting that the illustrator used photos of Bulliver when making the illustrations. They joined the railway in 1965 and debuted as Oliver as late as 1996, holding the role at least through 2005. So we can add 2 to the counter for Duck and Oliver. The Thomas here is played by a Hudsville Clark standard short tank, specifically number 32 Gothenburg. It joined the railway in 1987 and debuted as late as 1993, gaining Thomas's blue livery. If this engine looks familiar, that's because it's the same type of engine as Hamburg, the Mid-Hants Railway's first Thomas. But unlike Hamburg, Gothenburg maintained the role for much longer, still appearing as Thomas as of 2025. James is portrayed by the LMS Hughes Crab locomotive number 13065. They joined the railway in 1987 and initially ran in BR Black. It was then, after an overhaul, that the engine would be repainted into LMS Crimson Lake and debut as James in 2014. They'd maintain the role of James until 2018, when it was withdrawn in need of repairs. Percy is an R2 class packet numbered 1370. They entered preservation in the 1970s and found their way to the East Lancashire by 2008. Their debut as Percy was that same year, and they'd only hold the role until 2018 when it was moved to the Beamish Museum in Durham. The East Lancashire has had several engines portray diesel over the years. The first engine I could find was the Class 08 number 3232 Prudence. They joined the railway in 1998 and debuted as late as 2006. The following year, number 08944 would take over the role, lasting at least until 2008. The last engine I'll mention is number 13594, which debuted as late as 2014 and was acting as diesel as recently as 2024. In 2017, you could find Donald Douglas being played by the Class 27 number 52322. They joined the railway in 1995 and appears to have only played the character in 2017 and 2018. Here, Daisy is played by a number of DMUs. She debuted as late as 2011, portrayed by the Class 121 and 122 DMUs numbers 56289 and 55001. In 2012, a set of Class 108s and 117s could be found playing the role. This consisted of numbers 51562, 51922, 51382, and 51339. The 108s would leave the railway in 2014, having the Class 121 and 122 take their place in the set. The set would remain like this until 2017, when the 121 was withdrawn and replaced with the Class 110 number 59701. Mavis first debuted as late as 1993, played by the D210 class number D2774. At most, it held the role for about 8 years, as it was sold to the Strathspey Railway in 2001. They would then be replaced by the Class 03 number D2062. The engine joined the railway in 1997 and debuted as the character as late as 2014. The railway has also had appearances from the Class 40 diesel. They are portrayed by actual Class 40s number D335 and D345. 335 debuted first, joining the railway in 1988 and appearing in character for the 2013 event, with 345 taking over the role the next year. Salty is played by another Class 14, number D9537. They joined the railway in 2013 after being purchased by a private owner and debuted as late as 2017. This would be the only year they'd played the character, as they were moved to the Ecclesbourne Valley Railway the following year. And then we have Arthur, played by the BR Standard 4 number 80080. The engine was preserved by the Midland Railway in the 1980s and was loaned to the East Lancashire in 2010, debuting as the character the following year. And with the 3 diesels and the 2 Class 40s, that gives us 5 more accurate engines to add to the count. Here you can find the Lancashire and Yorkshire Pug number 51218 playing Percy. This engine joined the railway in 1965, being the first engine they acquired in preservation. They debuted as Percy as late as 2004, wearing a bright green livery, though shortly after they were returned to their normal colors. Diesel debuted as late as 1995, played by the Class 08 number 13336. They entered service in 1957, and after a good 28 years, they were withdrawn in 85, intended for scrap. Luckily, the engine was purchased by the Keighley and Worth that same year, and was relegated to shunting duties. The Keighley held Tom's events at least through 2006, though I'm unsure how many 13336 appeared at. And then we have Arthur, played by his real-life bassist, the IVAT-2MT number 41241. They joined the railway in 1967 and pulled the inaugural train when the railway reopened in '68. In preservation, 41241 was painted in its iconic Crimson Lake livery, and it ran like this until 1981 when it was reverted back to BR Black. This is the condition they appeared in when they debuted as Arthur as late as 2004. Unfortunately, we've never seen them portray Arthur in an accurate livery. They wouldn't return to Crimson Lake until 2018, well after the railway stopped Thomas events. But it's still cool that they got to portray Arthur in the first place. And with Arthur and Diesel, we can add 2 more engines to the counter. Percy is the only engine of note at this railway. Here they are played by the OQ class packet number 2150 Marty Monster. They joined the railway in 1998 and debuted as late as 2004, double-heading trains with the Thomas on duty. We have two engines that played Thomas on this railway. The first was Hudswell Clark number 1820, the sibling of the Nene Valley's Thomas. They joined the railway in the 1970s and debuted in the late 90s. At the time, there was a need for another Thomas replica, and the Bolton had an engine in mind, but it wouldn't be ready soon enough. So, they opted to convert 1820 and the Thomas in the meantime. 1820 last ran as Thomas in 2003, and the following year it was painted black and re-entered service on the Bolton. Number 1450 Dorothy is the engine that replaced 1820. They were a Hudswell Clark saddle tank that arrived on the railway in the 1970s. A restoration was started, but it was concluded that the engine was too small to run services on the entire line, so with there being a need for a Thomas, Dorothy was converted. Dorothy first appeared as Thomas in 2002. Work was still being done on it, so it shared the role with 1820 until being fully completed in 2004. By 2012, Dorothy was no longer in service as Thomas and has since been purchased by the Ribble Steam Railway. Percy could be found on the railway in the mid-90s. They were played by Peckett number 1159 Annie and would hold the role until being withdrawn in 2003. Replacing Annie that year was Cranford number 2, a Bagnall saddle tank that joined the railway in the 1970s. At most, it held the role until 2005, as that is when it was withdrawn. The next engine to take up the role would debut as late as 2012. This would be Hunslet number 2705 Beatrice, and as far as I can tell, this was the last engine to play Percy. Diesel debuted in 2004, played by the Class 08 number 08700. They had arrived on the railway earlier that year in an inoperable state, so the engine was repainted from BR blue to black and placed on stack display for the event. By 2011, the engine was operational again, but by that point it had left the railway, and another engine had taken over the role. This engine was the Class 08 number 3941, and with them being 08s, we can add 2 to the counter. We then have Daisy played by a pair of Class 107s, numbers 52031 and 52006. The pair joined the railway in 1998 and debuted around the same time. Hawk is a large tank engine built in 1998 by Brian Taylor based on a Kitston-Myers design. Its blue livery made it ideal to play Thomas, and it would debut as him as late as 2001. Percy is played by the KLR's Badger, a green saddle tank built in 1991 based on the designs of Kerr Stewart's Tattoo. It would technically be more accurate to have Badger play Peter Sam, but the engine is clearly meant to be Percy. It similarly debuted in 2001 and still plays Percy today. Toby is played by Tram number 7, a plate layers trolley that was given the outline of a J70 tram. They were built in 1991 and debuted as the character as late as 2001. The engine is primarily used for track inspection, but occasionally gets to pull passengers at special events such as Day Out with Thomas. Mavis is played by the diesel hydraulic engine J, who was built in 1992 and made their debut as late as 2001. Previously being painted in a yellow livery, they were repainted in black in the year 2000, likely to resemble the character. J is mainly used for maintenance work, but does get to carry passengers at special events. Lastly, we have the most recent addition to the railway, Katie, who can be found playing Emily. Katie joined the railway in 2015 and debuted as Emily the same year. Prior to this, they worked at the Fairborn Railway before being withdrawn in 1985. Diesel is the only engine of note here. They are played by the Class 08 number 4018. They joined the railway in the late 90s and debuted as late as 2006, and with this being an 08, we can add another accurate engine to the count. We have now arrived at the inspiration for the Arsdale Railway. First up, we have Bird, portrayed by his counterpart number 3, River Ert. They debuted as early as 1993, though you might have noticed it doesn't quite resemble how he looks in the books. That is because River Ert was rebuilt in 1972 with a taller chimney, cabin, dome well before it ever debuted as the character. The Island of Sodor book states that Bert was similarly rebuilt in 1973, but this was never illustrated. Regardless of this, I will still count this as an accurate engine. Next is Rex, played by the Ravenglasses number 7 River-esque. They similarly debuted in 1993, playing the role until 2007. We then have number 9 River Mike portraying Mike. They also debuted in 93, being one of the few engines on the Ravenglass to have a somewhat accurate livery, and they played the role until the last event in 2007. River Mike very recently got a chance to reprise its role in 2025, showing up as Mike for the Tally Clin's Audrey Extravaganza. Jock is the railway's last steam engine and is played by the Ravenglasses number 10 Northern Rock. Despite being the youngest of the engines, he actually debuted first. To mark the release of Jock's book, Rock was dressed as the character during the Easter of 1991, and even got to meet his creator, Christopher Audrey. They would then reappear with the other engines during the event in 1993. And we have Frank played by his counterpart, ICL number 4, Perkins. They debuted in 1993 with Perkins' standard yellow livery, but the following year they would paint them to resemble Frank's appearance in the book. It's unknown how long they kept this livery, but they were back in yellow by 2007. That concludes the characters we've seen in the books, but the last engines here have only gotten mentions in supplementary material. Sheila of Eskdale can be found portraying the engine Sigrid of Arsdale sometime in the late 90s. The iOS book describes Sigrid as a diesel hydraulic with a 4/6/4 wheel arrangement and a two-tone livery that sweeps down to a point. As you might expect, this also describes Sheila, making it an accurate engine. And then we have Cyril portraying Blisters 1 and 2. They are described as a pair of 4-wheel Lister diesels, which also describes Cyril. And with all the engines playing their counterparts, we can add 7 accurate engines to the count. This Thomas is played by the engine Clara from the Rail Miniature Railway. They are a diesel built to resemble a steam engine and debuted at the Cleethorpes as late as 2016. You can also find Toby played by the Railway's Lister diesel. The engine debuted as late as 1999 and has had several changes in appearance since then. Thomas is the only Sodar engine here and is played by number 2378 Brooks number 1. They are a 100th saddle tank that joined the railway in pieces in 1991. During its overhaul, it was decided to turn the engine into a Thomas replica, and it gained blue paint and side tanks. The engine debuted in 1999, but saw more use on other railways as a loaned engine. Brooks' last run as Thomas was in 2007, when it was converted back to a saddle tank. At this railway, you can find Barclay number 1245 playing Thomas. They joined the railway in 2004, where they were restored and painted into the Caledonian's blue livery. This made it a perfect candidate to play Thomas, and as late as 2010, it had debuted. Henry started making appearances as late as 2011, and as a nod to his famous story, they had him bricked in a tunnel. They are rather interestingly played by a tank engine, the previously discussed Fairborn 4MT number 42085, though with it being covered by the wall, you'd hardly be able to tell. Percy is played by Barclay number 2333, who is usually depicted in a maroon livery but was painted into green for their appearance as Percy. They would debut as late as 2011 and would keep the role at least through 2013. Diesel is an LMS Class 11, numbered AD601. They started appearing as late as 2013 and continued to make appearances at least through 2016. Daisy is played by a pair of Class 110s, numbers 52071 and 52077. They joined the railway in 1990 and debuted as Daisy as late as 2010. And then there is Mavis, portrayed by the Class 03 number D2072. They joined the railway in 1981 and debuted as late as 2007. The Nielsen Reed tank engine number 5710 Lord Roberts portrays Thomas here. They joined the railway in 1968 and were repaired over the next several years, returning to service in 1996, having its Caledonian blue livery changed to light blue for Thomas events. We have the LNER D49 class portraying Henry. This engine joined the railway in the early 2000s, in the midst of an overhaul that was completed in 2003. They debuted as Henry in 2005 and held the role until 2015 when its spoiler ticket expired. Percy is played by the Hawthorne Leslie saddle tank Lord King. They arrived on the railway in 1981, but saw little use due to its small size. That changed in 2005 when it was repainted to resemble Percy. As of today, Lord King is still masquerading as the character, although it is now on static display. Diesel is played by the Class 08, number D3558. They joined the railway in the late 80s and debuted as late as 2011. Being an 08, this would add another accurate engine to the count. And since we're in Scotland, it's only appropriate that we see one of the Scottish twins. Donald started showing up around 1996, played by the C-Class number 673, Maud, who makes a pretty spot-on Donald. At the latest, they kept the role of Donald until 2002, as that is when Maud was withdrawn for overhaul. Thomas is portrayed by Barclay number 2107, Harlexton. They previously worked at a steelworks in Corby and were preserved by the North Norfolk Railway. They moved to the Caledonian in the early 2000s, and around 2008 they had their sloping side tanks extended and their orange paint turned blue to portray Thomas. Percy is played by Peckett number 1376. They joined the railway in 1992 and debuted as late as 2010, but by this point the engine was in poor condition, so it was placed on static display. Diesel is played by the Class 11 number 12093. They were loaned to the railway from the Usshire Railway in 2002, and started appearing as Diesel as late as 2011, and can still be found playing the character to this day. And then there's Mavis, played by Yorkshire Engine Company number 2684 Mavis. I can't find too much information on this one. The best I can tell you is that it debuted as late as 2019. Starting with Diesel, you can find him played by number 08490. They are a Class 08 that debuted as late as 2011. Yet another Donald appears in Scotland, however this one is the most accurate of them all. This Donald is played by a Caledonian Railway 812 class, the real-life basis for Donald and Douglas. Number 828 is the last surviving member of its class, and it joined the railway in 1980. Their debut as Donald is unclear, but it likely started showing up between 1993 and the year 2000. And then there's Daisy, who is played by a pair of Class 107s and a Class 114. Number 52008, 52030, and 56047 joined the railway in the 90s and made their debut as late as 2003. Due to the deteriorating condition of the 107s, they would only last as Daisy until 2005. During their last run as Daisy, they were accompanied by the recently acquired pair of Class 117s, numbers 51402 and 51367, and following the 107's withdrawals, they would take over their duties. And so, with Diesel and Donald using their real-life bases, that would add 2 more accurate engines to the count. And now, we have arrived at the final railway in the United Kingdom. Thomas was first played by Bayer Peacock number 12 Hutchinson. The engine joined the railway in 1908, sporting an Indian red livery. In 1981, it was rebuilt, gaining a new boiler, a square cab, and a blue livery, which drew ire from many observers. This is the condition they debut in as late as 1993, holding the role at most till 1999. Taking over for Hutchinson was Dubs & Co. number 15 Caledonia. They joined the railway in 1885 and saw limited use throughout the years. In 1999, the engine was painted into a Caledonian blue livery, which was perfect to portray Thomas. Moving back to Hutchinson, they were withdrawn in 1999 for a rebuild, regaining its curved cab and its Indian red livery. They returned to service in 2001, debuting as James the Red Engine. And then there is Diesel, played by Skoma number 17 Viking, who joined the railway in 1992 and debuted as late as 2003. We'll now leave the UK and move on to the rest of Europe. Our next stop is the South Limburg Railway in the Netherlands. The railway started holding events as far back as 2003. They don't have Thomas replicas of their own, so they borrow ones from the UK. This includes such familiar faces as Pen Green from the Colne and Coventry from the Buckinghamshire. Aside from that, you can find Henry portrayed by the Swedish State Railway B-Class number 1220. They joined the railway in 1994, debuting as Henry as late as 2003, and they were likely chosen for the role due to their green livery. Gordon is similarly played by a Swedish Railway B-Class, specifically number 1289. They also joined in 1994, and also debuted around 2003. Diesel makes an appearance at this railway, and they look fairly accurate. Diesel is played by the NS600 series Diesel number 639. The NS600s are really just BR Class 11s that were brought over towards the end of World War II and were simply just reclassified. Number 639 would debut as Diesel in 2005 and would play him at least through 2010. The role would eventually be taken up by the NS2200 series Diesel number 2205 when they visited the railway in 2016. Donald is played by the Swedish Railway E2 class number 1040. This is not to be confused with the Billington E2s for which Thomas is based off. 1040 joined the railway in 1998 and started appearing as Donald as late as 2010. And then we have a set of Deutsches Bundesbahn Uerdingen rail buses portraying Daisy. The set is comprised of numbers 79809, 99852, and 99851 who debuted as late as 2003. Henry is yet another War Department export. They are played by the Austerity tender engine Longmore, who was sold to the museum after the war. You might recall this being the same type of engine as number 600 from the Severn Valley. Henry would make their debut as late as 2010 and has been relegated to static display. Emily is an NS 1300 series locomotive dubbed Grown. They were brought to the museum in the 1950s following a restoration to repair damage it sustained during the war. And much like Henry, Emily also started to appear around 2010 and was similarly placed on static display. We'll now move to the Danish Railway Museum found in Aldesna, Denmark. Like in the Netherlands, the museum also borrows Thomas locomotives from the UK, but there was a period where they did have their own locomotive. Prior to 2010, you could find the Danish State Railways HS class number 415 portraying Thomas. Very little is known about this engine's time as Thomas, but it appears that the engine had been modified, gaining side tanks and round portholes. By 2010, the engine had been reverted back to its normal appearance, and other engines would take over the role. Alongside Thomas, you can find the DSB Tractor number 140 playing Diesel. This is a small shunting engine that took up the role as late as 2010. The next replica can be found in Poland at the Railway Museum of Silesia. Here, Thomas is played by a Polish State Railway class TKT-48 number 186. Number 186 joined the railway after 1998, and by 2004 they were in a pretty sorry state, being rusted and unable to steam. The engine's condition improved around 2012 when it was transformed into Thomas, receiving a new coat of paint. The engine was still unable to steam, but that is true for most of the engines at the museum, and number 186 still sports its new look to this day. Interestingly, this Thomas has been a permanent addition of this railway since it opened in 2013. Cukrovnia Lesmajes number 609 is the last type locomotive that worked at the Lesmajes sugar factory until 1987. Afterwards, it was moved to Germany, where it sat for several years until finally it arrived at the Krośnicka in 2012, where it was transformed into Thomas for an exhibit. Our journey now takes us to Japan, for Dare with Thomas at the Oigawa Railway. The Oigawa's Thomas debuted in 2014, played by the Japanese National Railway C11 class number 227. They joined the railway in 1975, becoming Japan's first preserved steam engine and the flagship locomotive of the railway. As Thomas, they primarily run in his light blue livery, but in 2021 they were repainted into his LBSC livery from The Adventure Begins. Shortly after donning this look though, number 227 was withdrawn in anticipation of its boiler ticket expiring. In its place, they had another C11 take over the role, being number 190. They joined the railway in 2001 after years of being in storage and became operational by 2003. As of 2025, 227 is still out of service, and so 190 is still acting as Thomas. In 2015, James joined the railway, played by the C56 class number 44. Number 44 previously worked in Thailand during the Pacific War and was one of the few engines that survived the conflict. They joined the railway in 1979, and after debuting as James, could be seen running trains alongside Thomas up until 2019 when it was withdrawn due to a malfunction. Even in withdrawal, number 44 could still be seen as James at Senju Station with the other Sodor residents. Percy also debuted in 2015, portrayed by the C12 class number 208. They joined the railway in the late 1970s and has mostly been used for spare parts. In 2015, the engine was rebuilt to resemble Percy and placed on static display at Senju Station. Toby is played by Southern Alps DD202. They are the latest addition to the Thomas fleet, joining the railway in 1982 and debuting as the character in 2022. Unlike Thomas and James, who run on the Oigawa main line, Toby runs on the Ikawa line, which climbs the mountain up to Ikawa Station. Rusty is a Kato Works DB1 locomotive number DB9. It was built in 1955 and ran passenger trains on the Ikawa line with its 8 other siblings until 1982 when more powerful engines were brought on. Since then, it's been relegated to shunting duties, and in 2014, DB9 would debut as Rusty. And lastly, we have the master of the railway himself, Hero, who debuted alongside Thomas and Rusty in 2014. They are played by the class 9600 number 49616, who joined the railway sometime after 1976 and was eventually placed on static display. Since Hero is very much tied to Japan, it makes sense that they'd choose to portray him when they started hosting the event. Now, Oigawa is the primary location of Thomas events in Japan, but there is one other place you can find the Thomas replica. To celebrate the 75th anniversary of the Railway series, the Kyoto Railway Museum hosted the Thomas the Tank Engine exhibition. This was a traveling exhibit, which showcased a variety of art and props from the franchise's history. And as part of the festivities, the museum dressed their C11 number 64 up as Thomas. Their debut was in 2020, and they can still be seen as Thomas as of 2025. Moving south, we head for Australia, to their National Railway Museum. This narrow gauge Thomas debuted as late as 1993, and is played by the Mile End Light Railways engine Bub. Mile End was the previous location of the National Railway Museum before they relocated in 1988. Bub was built at Mile End in 1987, and was moved to Port Adelaide a year later, where it pulled passengers around the museum. Here, Thomas is played by Perry Engineering number 271 Klondike. They were built in 1927 as part of a batch of 12 locomotives used to build the Hugh Dam near Albury. It eventually found its way to the Bellarine Railway and would debut as Thomas in 2009. They also have Henry played by the Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne V-Class number 1209. They joined the railway in 1982, having previously been withdrawn in 1971 intended for scrap. After joining, they were restored to working order and painted in the Western Australian government's green livery, which made it perfect for Henry's debut in 2006. 1209 was never operational as Henry as it was taken out of service in 2007, citing issues with its firebox and other mechanical problems. So since its debut, it's been on static display, allowing children to enter its cab. Percy is a Vulcan Ironworks saddle tank number 2539. It was built and imported from the United States to help construct Henderson Naval Base. It joined the railway in the 1970s and debuted as Percy as late as 2006. Next, we have the T-Class number 251 playing Donald and Douglas. They were withdrawn in the 70s intended for scrap, but was saved by the Geelong Steam Preservation Society and moved to what would become the Bellarine. The engine would debut as the character in 2009, following an 18-year overhaul, and as of 2025 can still be found playing them. Oliver started appearing as late as 2012, played by Barclay number 1543 Pausier. The engine previously sat at the Menzies Creek Museum before being moved to the Bellarine in 2010, where it was overhauled into working order. You can also find Daisy on the railway, played by the Tasmanian Government DP Class number 29. They joined the railway in 1979, along with its classmate number 28, debuting as Daisy as late as 2007 and holding the role at the latest until 2012. In the 1980s, the railway would acquire two Drury V-Class diesels that would go on to play characters at the events. Mavis would show up first, played by Unit number 8. They joined the railway in 1988 and debuted as the character as late as 2006. The V-Class's design was actually based on the Class 04s, which explained why they resembled Mavis so much. The other V-Class, VA1, would portray Salty. They are specifically one of the downgraded units with a less powerful engine. They joined the railway in 1983 and debuted as Salty as late as 2012. And lastly, we have Skarloey, played by Hudswell Clark number 646. They joined the railway in the late 60s and debuted as the character as late as 2006. Here, Fowler number 5265 can be found portraying Thomas. The engine was built in 1886 and remained in service until 1912. After that, it didn't see much use and was kept in storage for many years. In 1974, they were moved to the Emu Bay Railway's workshop where a restoration was begun. This restoration was moved to the Don River Railway in 1981 and was completed in 2007. During the restoration, it was decided to dress the engine up as Thomas, and only a few months later it would debut. You can also find Henry played by the Robert Stevenson and Hawthorne M-Class number 4. They were built in 1951, and while I'm fairly certain they debuted alongside Thomas, I could only find them appearing as late as 2014. And then there is Donald, played by Dubs & Co. number 8 Heemskirk. They were built in the year 1900 for freight work on the Emu Bay Railway. It was retired from service in 1964 and then moved to the Don River Railway in 78, where it was rebuilt. After re-entering service, the engine would debut as Donald at the railway's first Thomas event in 2007. Thomas first debuted as late as 2009, played by Peckett number 1711 Sir John Grice. They were built in 1926 for the West Melbourne Metropolitan Gas Company and remained there until 1962. They eventually found their way to the Puffing Billy in 74, where they were restored and put back to work. And when the railway decided to host Thomas events, they fit the engine with a fiberglass shell to play the character. You can also find Diesel here, played by the DH Class number 5. They joined the railway in 2008 and debuted the following year. Here, Thomas is played by the Vulcan Z18 class tank engine number 1803. They were built in 1882 and worked for 80 years before being withdrawn in 1962. After withdrawal, the engine was intended for scrap, but was purchased by the Transport Museum. It was moved to Thermere in 1975, where it sat for many years, gradually deteriorating. It was then in 2008 that the museum was making plans to host Dale with Thomas, and it was decided to restore 1803 and dress them as the character. The restoration was completed in November of that year, and Thomas would debut the following year, albeit on static display. Among the engines, you can also find Henry, played by the Hunslet Z27 class number 2705. They joined the railway around the late 1960s and operated until the 1970s when it was put on static display. The engine wouldn't move again until 1994 when it was overhauled into working order. This overhaul also saw the restoration of the engine's green livery. It was then in 2009 that 2705 would take up the role as Henry. They would hold the role until July of 2012 when 2705 was repainted into a black livery. Taking over the role was Clyde Engineering's C36 class number 3642. They joined the museum in the 1960s and would debut a few years after completing its overhaul in 2008. 2025 would see the debut of James at the museum, played by number 2705. After many years in black, 2705 would be overhauled in 2022, and during said overhaul, the engine would be made to resemble James. 2025 also saw many of the engines dressed as their All Engines Go counterparts, including James, which has drawn some ire from longtime fans. While I'm not crazy about the face, I do have to admit that James actually looks really nice. Percy also debuted in 2025, receiving the All Engines Go treatment. They are portrayed by the Robert Stevenson E17 class number 18. They were built in 1866 and were brought to the museum in the 1960s, where they were placed on static display. Toby is played by CPH Motorrail number 18. They debuted as the character in 2009 and have consistently appeared at Thomas events since then. Donald has been played by a number of different engines. They first appeared in 2009, played by the NSW C35 class number 3526. They joined the museum in 1975, being placed on static display. The engine was restored in 2004, and after debuting, held the role until 2012 when it was withdrawn from service. Fortunately, around the same time, number 2705 was being repainted, and would replace number 3526 as Donald the following year. They'd maintain the role until 2022, although in 2017, the Bayer Peacock C30T class number 3016 briefly took over the role during their visit to the museum. As of 2023, another C30T class has taken over the role, number 3001. The engine had been on static display since 1997 and was overhauled in 2018, with it being complete in 2023, just in time to debut as Donald. There is also Emily, played by the NSW M36 class number 78. They joined the museum in 1928, being put on static display, and debuted as the character in 2025. Then there is Hero, played by the Baldwin D59 class number 5910. This engine is an import from the United States, and they were built in 1952 and remained in service until being put on static display in 1998. Here, Thomas is played by the DD17 class number 1049, Storm and Norman. They joined the railway in 1975 and re-entered service around 1996 wearing a maroon livery. They were painted blue in 2003 to portray Thomas and held the role until 2012. It likely would have continued to reprise its role as Thomas had it not been for the repeated bushfires setting back any plans to host the event. As late as 2008, we saw the debut of James, played by Clyde Engineering's C17 class number 934. They arrived on the railway in 1975, and after an overhaul, it re-entered service in the 80s. It donned a black livery throughout the 90s, and then in 2003, it was painted into Hogwarts Express red for the upcoming Harry Potter event. This livery also worked to portray the engine as James for Thomas events. Like Norman, they'd only hold the role until the bushfires derailed those plans. They also had Douglas at these events, played by number 1072, City of Lithgow. They were a Walker BB 18 1/4 class built in 1956 that joined the railway in 1975. They re-entered service in 1981 and debuted as the character as late as 2004. This park started hosting Thomas events as late as 2012, and at these events you can find Fowler number 17881 portraying Thomas. They were built in 1928 for use on the South Johnstone Sugar Mill and eventually found their way to Timbertown in preservation. Edward, making his first and only appearance on the list, can be found played by the DD-17 class number 1051. The engine entered preservation at the Red Bank Railway Museum in 1970 and remained there until the museum's closure in 1992. It was then moved to the workshop where it would run rail tours, and then as late as 2009 they would debut as Edward. James is played by the C-17 number 988. They had been previously put up as a theme park attraction, being used as the Hogwarts Express for Movie World's Harry Potter experience. This stint lasted from 2001 to 2003, and afterwards the engine was stored at the workshop. Its red livery made it perfect to portray James at the Thomas event in 2009, and it would last as the character until 2011 when it was moved to Archer Park Rail Museum. You can also find both Scottish twins at the museum. Donald is played by the B-13.5 class number 398, and Douglas is played by the PB-15 class number 444. 398 was originally built as a tank engine in 1904 and was rebuilt in its current form in 1937. By 1953, it was relegated to shunting duties at the workshop, and when they became a museum in 2002, it was placed on static display outside the building. 444 was first preserved by the Red Bank Railway Museum and was transferred to the workshop after their closure in 1992 and was placed on static display. Both engines would then debut as their respective characters as late as 2009. Moving on, we have D199, played by the 1250 class number 1262. 1262 was built in 1961 and ran for almost 30 years before being retired in 1988. By 2001, the engine was in the hands of the workshop, who had the engine partially disassembled as part of an exhibit for the museum. And as late as 2009, you can find it playing the character. And then we have Lady, played by the Nielsen A10 class number 6. They were built in 1865, making it one of the oldest engines at the museum. After its long career, it was put on display at the Red Bank, and with it closing in 1992, they were moved to the workshop, and in 2009, they debuted as Lady. We'll now stop in New Zealand to check out the Silverstream Railway. The Silverstream held their first Thomas event in 1995, and here you can find Bagnall number 2475 playing Thomas. They were built in 1932 for the Nelson Brothers Freezing Works, and remained there until being acquired by Mainline Steam in 1993. By 95, the engine had been repainted from its dark green livery to Thomas's light blue, and made its debut at the Silverstream. Since then, the engine could be found playing Thomas at various railways all over New Zealand, most frequently the Glenbrook Vintage Railway. Speaking of the Glenbrook, there's only one other Soder engine present, and it's Rusty, played by Rustin and Hornsby number 3. Interestingly, Rusty was built by Rustin and Hornsby. In fact, that's where his name comes from. But this engine is a different design. Rusty debuted as late as 1994, wearing number 3's yellow livery. At some point, the engine was repainted orange to better suit the character. We have now arrived at our final country, the United States, and we'll start with the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin. This is where we in the States got our very first taste of Dale with Thomas. Green Bay held their first Thomas event in 1996, and at this event you could find this little engine playing Thomas. This was Wisconsin Public Service number 702, a Plymouth JGT class switcher that came to the railway in 1963. Throughout 96, the engine would be rebuilt to resemble Thomas, and after debuting would make appearances at several events across the country. 702 would run as Thomas until 2002, when better replicas were being introduced, and subsequently had its likeness to Thomas removed and was put into storage. Now 702 is widely considered to be the very first replica that the States got. However, there is an engine that predates it, Pullman Company number 29. This saddle tank debuted as Thomas around 1993 at an unlicensed Thomas event held by the museum. Very little is known about the engine's time as Thomas and the event it debuted at. I'm not even sure the information I have is 100% accurate, so if you know something about this Thomas, feel free to let me know in the comments. Anyway, the engine was eventually replaced with number 702 and can currently be found on static display at the museum. Strasburg's Thomas is played by the Brooklyn Eastern District Terminal's number 15. This engine was originally built as a saddle tank in 1917 and worked as a dockside switcher until being retired in '63. After that, the engine changed hands several times until landing at the Strasburg in 1998. The Strasburg was to be a filming location for the at the time upcoming movie Thomas and the Magic Railroad, and as part of the deal to let them film there, permission was granted to transform number 15 into a real steaming version of Thomas. Number 29 may have technically been the first steam engine to play Thomas in the States, but number 15 would be the first, and so far only, to move under its own power. They would debut as Thomas at the Strasbourg's first event in 1998. However, the engine was only partially complete at the time and was unable to move without the aid of a diesel. The engine would be fully complete by 1999, and after a proper debut, it would start touring around different railroads. In 2002, Strasbourg would start rolling out a set of new Thomas replicas to supplement the job of number 15. These units were scratch-built and made to look accurate to the show prop. There were 5 replicas in total, 3 standard gauge and 2 narrow, and along with number 15, they would visit various railways for their Thomas events. These replicas were not actual engines, and were more akin to a caboose, with them being fitted with an air whistle and an emergency brake. Because of this, they cannot move on their own and require an engine from the designated railway to push them. Including these does technically break my functional engine rule, but these replicas are so iconic I couldn't just leave them out. After the debut, these units would become the face of day with Thomas in the United States, similar to how the Mid-Hands Thomas is in the UK. In 2014, all Thomases would receive an upgrade, gaining a new CGI-styled face. These faces contained animatronics that allowed the eyes and mouth of Thomas to move in time with a speaker spouting out voice lines. 2014 also saw the debut of the Strasbourg's Percy replica. This was also a show-accurate dummy unit, and being made around the time of the Thomas upgrades meant that Percy was built with the new animatronic face. Unlike Thomas, there was only a single Percy unit built, and after its debut, it would join the Thomases in touring around the country. You can also find Mavis here, played by Strasbourg Railroad number 8618. They are an SW8 switcher that came to the railway in 2009 to handle freight duties. They would debut at the Strasbourg Spooktacular event in 2019, and since then, Mavis has made regular appearances at the Strasbourg's Thomas events. And the very last engine we'll discuss is Rusty, played by Strasbourg Railroad number 2, Dinky. They are a Plymouth 10-ton diesel that joined the railway in 1984. They initially showed up wearing dark red, but in 2013 they were repainted into a Rusty-inspired orange livery. Dinky wouldn't fully debut as Rusty until 2020, when he was given a face, and it's made appearances every year since then, usually pulling passengers in wagons on a short section of track. So now with that all said and done, let's do some math. There's lots of interesting data that can be gleaned from all the engines we just covered, so I figured I would share some statistics about the replicas to close out the video. Breaking down the replicas by country, the United Kingdom has the most, accounting for 78.3% of the list. As Thomas's origins lie in the UK, this was expected. If we divide up the UK, we see that England makes up 67.1% of replicas, with Scotland and Wales making up 3.7% and 7.5% respectively. Denmark, Poland, and New Zealand tie for the least amount of replicas, with each making up 0.6% or 1.8% collectively. With the United States being one of Thomas's biggest markets, you'd expect it to rank pretty high, but in actuality it has the 5th most replicas with 3.4%. This can be explained by the fact that most of the replicas here are provided by a single railway, so there's not a lot of variety. Looking through the list of engines, I found that a majority of the replicas are steam engines, which, given the show we're talking about, makes complete sense. Steam engines specifically make up 59.6% of replicas, not an overwhelming majority, but still a decent size. Diesels comparatively make up 38.5% of the list. The remaining 1.9% pretty much accounts for the Strasbourg dummy units that are neither steam or diesel. Now, if we break down the replicas by characters, Thomas has the most, with 50 replicas making up 15.5% of the list. This isn't that surprising. Thomas is the main character and the namesake of the event. It'd honestly be weird if he didn't have the most. Hunslet, Clark, and Strasbourg are the most common builders of Thomas replicas, with Hunslet making up 12% of Thomas's and the other two each making up 10%. Taking second place is Percy, making up 12.4% with 40 replicas. This also makes sense. Percy is similarly a main character in the series, and being a tank engine, they'd be easier to replicate than most other engines. It would seem that Peckett-built engines are most often used for Percy replicas, with them making up 35% of Percy's. Hunslet comes after, making up 17.5%. And coming in third is Diesel, with 37 replicas accounting for 11.5%. Most railways have at least one diesel engine on hand, so it was never too much trouble to replicate the character. On top of that, he's the main face of diesels in the series, so it's understandable why he appears more than the other diesels. Speaking of diesels, Daisy and Mavis rank second and third behind Diesel, having 26 and 20 replicas respectively. There's a surprising amount of DMUs still around today, which explains why Daisy ranks so high. Mavis is similar to Diesel in that most railways have a Diesel shunter and it'd be easy to turn them into the character. On the opposite end of things, Fred, Frank, Sigurd of Arsdale, and the Blisters have the least amount of replicas, with 1 each. I think we all know why this is. They just didn't appear all that often in the series. Frank is the only one to actually appear in a book, and even then only once. The others just got passing mentions in supplementary material, so it's easy to see why they don't have more replicas than they do. Of the famous 8, Edward is represented the least, with only a single replica to his name. This puts him just behind Gordon, who has 5. Thomas and Percy obviously have the most, but behind them is Henry with an impressive 20 replicas. Donald and Douglas make up 6.5% of replicas, having a total of 21. Though, if you split them up, more replicas are attributed to Donald having 10 compared to Douglas's 9, with 2 engines ambiguously being both. Of the Skarloey engines, Rusty, interestingly, has the most representation with 6 replicas in contrast with the other engines who have 1 or 2. I'm not quite sure why this is, but my guess is that Rusty is a small diesel with a simple shape that's easy to replicate. The real interesting thing is that of his replicas, only 2 of the Rusties are narrow gauge. Speaking of gauges, I also found that 76.1% of replicas run on standard gauge rails, which shouldn't be a shock. It is called standard gauge for a reason. The remaining 23.9% accounts for both narrow gauge and minimum gauge replicas, with 16.1% coming from narrow gauge and 7.8% coming from minimum gauge. Moving on, how many accurate engines did you think we'd find? 20? 30? 50? Well, we found a total of 81 replicas that use a character accurate basis, which accounts for 25.2% of engines on the list. All the accurate engines pretty much come from the UK, as most of the characters use British locomotives as their basis. A large portion of characters were never going to have accurate replicas, either due to their bases having long been scrapped, as in the case with Thomas and Toby, or their bases not existing, as in the case of Percy and Lady. It's still impressive that a quarter of the list is made up of accurate engines. Diesel has the most amount of accurate replicas, and it's by a wide margin. 24 out of the 37 Diesels were portrayed by Class 08. Compare that to Duck, who comes in second, with 9 of his 13 replicas being played by 5700s. These two having the most amount of accurate replicas comes down to the fact that the Class 08s and the 5700s were some of the most produced classes of engines. Nearly 1,000 08s have been built since 1952, and about 100 still exist today. So if a railway has a diesel shunter, there's a good chance it's an 08. The 5700s ultimately have less engines around today, which accounts for the difference between Duck and Diesel. Over 800 Panniers were produced by the 1950s, and only 16 remain today, which is frankly more than most classes still have around. Most of the remaining accurate replicas are made up of engines with a book counterpart, such as Alfred and Judy playing Bill and Ben, or the Tally-Clin engines playing the engines from the Skarloey. So, after all that, you're probably wondering how many replicas did I actually find? Well, of the 49 different Thomas characters at 63 railways spread across 10 countries, I cataloged a grand total of 322 replicas. Now, this isn't the actual total, as I definitely left some replicas off the list. You could probably take a look at the wiki and find a handful of replicas I didn't even mention. As I said at the start, information on these things is hard to come by, and I did my best to track down as many replicas as I could. If you happen to know about an engine I didn't cover, or have more information on one that I did, feel free to let me know down in the comments. Even so, 322 replicas is still an impressive number, far more than I was initially expecting to find. This video was a long time coming. I came up with the concept for the video at the end of 2024, and have been working on it the entire year. I initially wanted this out in time for the 80th anniversary back in May, but there was just no way that was going to happen. The amount of research required was so staggering that this has officially become the longest video I've worked on, so I hope you found the information as interesting as I did. Perhaps there was a replica you were particularly intrigued by. I've always had a fondness for the Strasbourg replicas, but that's mostly because I've been around them most of my life. I also find the Oigawa engines really fascinating, as despite looking so different from the actual engines, they still manage to capture the spirit of the characters so well. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you all that I do have a Patreon. For $5 a month, you can get early access to new videos and the latest updates on all my projects. I'm currently in the process of making improvements to my older Lionel models. So far, I've completed the LBSC Thomas as well as Origins James, with Edward being my next priority. I plan to make update shorts on each of the models when finished, and those will probably come out on Patreon first, so please consider joining. Doing so really helps me keep doing what I'm doing. Link is in the description. Anyway, that's where I'll end the video for today. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I thank you for watching. Alright guys, bye.